This mansion didn't ruin a man slowly. It did it the moment he decided to live inside it. The mistake wasn't building the house. The mistake was believing that money obeys walls. From the outside, this place was supposed to signal permanence, stability, arrival. But from the inside, it behaved like a machine designed to consume certainty. Every corridor increased pressure. Every finished room locked in a future expense that could not be reversed. And the moment the owner crossed the threshold as a resident, not a builder, the clock started running in only one direction, because this house was never neutral. It demanded timing, and it arrived at the exact wrong moment. There's a comforting myth people like to repeat about extreme wealth, that excess is harmless if the fortune is large enough. That scale protects you, that the bigger the bank account, the more forgiving the future becomes. This mansion exists to disprove that idea. The danger wasn't visible. Guests didn't see it. Newspapers didn't write about it. Even the owner refused to name it. But the structure carried a hidden assumption that markets would remain obedient, that credit would stay friendly, that confidence could be converted into permanence. That assumption was wrong. What makes this house unsettling isn't its size. It's the fact that it locked an entire life into a single bet. Once finished, there was no way to downscale, no way to quietly retreat. The house didn't allow humility. It demanded continuity. It required the owner to keep winning forever, and no one does. The first nights inside were quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that feels earned, not peaceful. Rooms waited to be justified. Staff waited to be paid. Systems waited to be fed. Heat, light, maintenance, reputation, everything had to be sustained daily, whether the outside world cooperated or not. This is where the danger hides. A mansion doesn't just cost money to build, it costs momentum to survive. And momentum is fragile. The house assumed the future would look like the past, that expansion would continue, that confidence would compound. But the economy does not care about confidence, and timing is indifferent to ambition. When conditions shifted, subtly at first, the house didn't adjust. It couldn't. It had already committed to a version of reality that no longer existed. What's unsettling is how quickly admiration turned into obligation. The same people who praised the audacity of the mansion expected it to be maintained at that level forever. Retreat would look like failure. Downsizing would look like weakness. Selling would look like confession. So the owner stayed and paid, and stayed longer than he should have. By the time the warning signs became undeniable, the house had already done its work. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, through fixed costs, expectations, and a reputation that no longer matched reality. The mansion didn't collapse. It endured, and that endurance was the problem. Because when a structure refuses to shrink, the person inside it must. And somewhere between the first celebratory dinner and the first missed obligation, the balance tipped. Not because of recklessness, but because the house had been built for a future that never arrived. The question isn't why the owner failed. The real question is why this house required him to never fail at all. The mansion didn't just assume wealth, it reorganized life around it. Once the move was complete, the house stopped being a symbol and became a system. And systems don't care about optimism. They care about inputs, fuel, labor, maintenance, attention, cash flow. Every day, the building demanded proof that the future was still intact. At first, this felt manageable. The fortune had history behind it. Years of success had trained everyone involved to believe that setbacks were temporary and growth was permanent. The mansion wasn't reckless, it was confident. And confidence, when reinforced by past victories, feels indistinguishable from certainty. But confidence hardens quickly when it becomes infrastructure. The house required staff not as a luxury, but as a condition of function. Empty rooms still needed heat. Ornate finishes still demanded care. Landscapes still consumed labor. Reputation still needed to be upheld. The mansion could not be paused. It ran whether markets cooperated or not. This is where timing becomes lethal. The financial world that made this fortune possible was already shifting, but the signals were subtle enough to ignore. Credit tightened slightly. Speculation became more fragile. Returns required more leverage, more exposure, more risk. But the house did not see nuance. It only saw the total, and the total was fixed. The owner's wealth was no longer liquid in practice. It was committed, psychologically, socially, and structurally. Selling assets to cover expenses felt backward. Borrowing to sustain appearances felt temporary. Every solution assumed recovery was imminent. That assumption shaped every decision. The mansion amplified that pressure. Guests didn't see stress. They saw scale. They saw certainty. They saw a man who had already won. And once that image exists, maintaining it becomes part of the operating cost. To retreat would not just reduce comfort, it would rewrite the story everyone believed. So the owner leaned forward instead of stepping back. More commitments were made to justify the existing ones. More confidence was required to protect the earlier confidence. The house became a multiplier, not of wealth, but of exposure. Every market movement mattered more. Every delay hurt deeper. Every miscalculation echoed longer. This is how excess turns fragile. The mansion wasn't draining money in isolation. It was narrowing options. It made flexibility look like failure. It transformed caution into embarrassment. The structure itself discouraged adaptation because adaptation would imply that the original decision had been flawed, and that was unacceptable. What's often missed in stories like this is that collapse doesn't begin with loss. It begins with rigidity, with the moment when success becomes too structured to retreat from. When the past dictates behavior more strongly than the present. The mansion didn't bankrupt its owner overnight. It trained him to ignore exit. By the time conditions worsened enough to force recognition, the house had already done something irreversible. It had converted a changing world into a fixed obligation. And when the outside stopped cooperating, there was nowhere for the pressure to go, except inward. The question now wasn't whether the mansion could survive. It was whether the man inside it still could. The most dangerous moment wasn't when money began to thin. It was when the mansion still looked untouched. From the outside, nothing had changed. The lawns were kept. The lights came on at the same hour. Dinners were still served with the same choreography. To neighbors and visitors, the house appeared to be fulfilling its purpose. And that illusion mattered more than the balance sheet. Because permanence, once displayed, becomes an expectation. The owner had crossed a line that many fortunes never do. He had turned liquidity into architecture, flexible capital into stone, iron, and ritual. And architecture doesn't forgive delay. It doesn't accept explanation. It demands continuity. Behind closed doors, adjustments were already happening. Maintenance was deferred in places guests never saw. Payments were stretched. Decisions were framed as temporary measures, not reversal. Every compromise carried the same justification. Conditions would normalize soon, but normalization requires time. And time was exactly what the mansion consumed fastest. The house aged differently than the fortune did. Market shifts were immediate. Income responded quickly to pressure. The building, however, moved slowly and always forward. Wear accumulated. Systems degraded. The cost of standing still increased every month. This is the trap of large structures built on recent success. They are designed for stability, not volatility. And when volatility arrives, they don't collapse, they tighten. The owner felt it in choices that no longer felt optional. Selling assets to cover operating costs meant shrinking the future to protect the present. Borrowing against reputation felt safer than admitting vulnerability. And all of it happened while the house remained visually unchanged. That contrast is brutal. The mansion became proof that denial doesn't look like panic. It looks like discipline, like professionalism, like holding the line. From the inside, it felt responsible. From the outside, it looked admirable. Only the numbers told a different story. And numbers, unlike buildings, don't care about appearance. By now, the owner was no longer preserving wealth. He was managing decline without naming it. The mansion demanded that decline remain invisible. Any visible retreat would devalue the very thing he was trying to protect. So the strategy narrowed further. The house became quieter, not smaller. Staff remained, but thinner. Rooms stayed open, but colder. Every choice prioritized the illusion that nothing fundamental had shifted. The structure still stood. Therefore, the decision to build it must still have been correct. That belief mattered, Because once a decision of this scale is admitted as a mistake, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads backward, rewriting the entire story of success that came before it. The owner wasn't just protecting a house. He was protecting the narrative of his own competence. The mansion weaponized that instinct. It made retreat psychologically impossible before it became financially impossible. And by the time both aligned, the outcome was already decided. Not by a single crash, but by a sequence of small refusals to adapt. The house did not fail dramatically. It endured long enough to make survival expensive. And endurance, in this case, was not strength. It was delay. What remained was a question the mansion had postponed for as long as possible. How long can permanence be performed after it has already expired? Failure, when it finally arrived, didn't announce itself. It formalized itself. There was no dramatic eviction, no public disgrace at the gates, no single day when everything collapsed. Instead, control slipped quietly from the owner's hands, not because the mansion stopped functioning, but because it kept functioning after he no longer could. That's the final cruelty of excess. It survives you. At some point, the house stopped being a personal decision and became an institutional problem. Obligations accumulated faster than solutions. Creditors began to care less about reputation and more about guarantees. Flexibility vanished. Choices narrowed to outcomes. The owner didn't lose the mansion because of a single bad move. He lost it because the structure had been built to assume uninterrupted dominance. Once dominance ended, even slightly, the house had no smaller mode to fall back on. This is where timing finishes its work. The wealth that once built railroads, moved markets, and bent systems was now forced to negotiate with them. And systems do not negotiate with sentiment. They liquidate. The mansion, ironically, was still admired. Its presence remained impressive. Its rooms still carried authority. But authority without ownership is just weight. And that weight now belonged to the man who had to explain why the numbers no longer matched the scale. The house didn't forgive him for arriving too late in history. Economic conditions hardened. Speculation cooled. Leverage that once amplified gains now amplified exposure. The mansion, designed as a monument to arrival, revealed itself as a monument to misalignment. It belonged to an era already closing when it was finished. That is the hidden danger of legacy projects. They often arrive after the window that made them rational has already begun to shut. When the end came, it wasn't theatrical. It was procedural. The mansion passed from personal possession into public consequence. Ownership dissolved into paperwork. What had been built as proof of victory became evidence in a reckoning. The house remained. The fortune didn't. And that reversal mattered. Because once a mansion outlives its owner's control, its meaning flips. It no longer says, "I arrived." It says, "I stayed too long." It becomes less about ambition and more about miscalculation. The owner had not misunderstood wealth. He had misunderstood time, and time is the only thing architecture cannot negotiate with. The mansion stood still as the world moved on, and when movement returned, it returned without him. The structure had become permanent. His position had not. What remained was an object no longer aligned with its original purpose. Too large for private life, too expensive for sentiment, too heavy to disappear. The house survived. The strategy did not. And survival, in this case, was not victory. It was evidence. The mansion still stands today, and that is what makes the story uncomfortable. Because when a house survives the fortune that created it, it stops being a home and becomes a question, not about beauty or craftsmanship, but about judgment, about sequence, about the cost of arriving after the moment has already passed. This mansion was never ugly. It was never foolish. It was simply mistimed. It was built as if the economic conditions that created the owner's rise were permanent, as if expansion was a law of nature, as if success, once achieved at scale, could be frozen into stone. But wealth does not freeze. It flows, or it evaporates. And architecture, for all its grandeur, only knows how to stay still. That is the final lesson embedded in these walls. The house did not destroy its owner through extravagance alone. Plenty of men have lived in expensive houses and survived. What made this mansion lethal was that it arrived at the exact moment when flexibility mattered most, when the ability to shrink, adapt, and retreat quietly was more valuable than the ability to impress. The mansion offered none of that. It locked its owner into a version of himself that the world no longer rewarded, a man who had to remain certain in an era that was turning cautious, a man whose identity had become inseparable from visible success, even as the foundations of that success were shifting beneath him. This is why the story was forgotten for so long. It doesn't fit the usual morality. There was no fraud, no scandal, no reckless gambling spree, just a series of reasonable decisions made under outdated assumptions. And those are the most dangerous decisions of all. When the house passed into public hands, its meaning changed completely. What had once been a declaration of dominance became a case study. Visitors no longer saw a victory. They saw a warning, even if they couldn't name it. The rooms felt oversized. The ambition felt heavy. The silence carried a different weight. The mansion became honest only after it was no longer owned. That's the irony. While it functioned as a private residence, it had to lie. It had to perform stability. It had to insist that the future was secure. Once removed from that burden, it could finally tell the truth. That timing matters more than scale. That excess without flexibility is fragile. That permanence is an illusion borrowed from a future that may never arrive. The owner didn't fail because he aimed too high. He failed because he aimed too late. He built a monument for an economy that had already begun to close its doors. And by the time the house was ready, the world that justified it was quietly leaving. This mansion is not a symbol of greed. It is a symbol of confidence that overstayed its welcome. And that is why it still resonates. Because modern systems still reward visibility over resilience. They still encourage people to convert momentum into fixed commitment, to turn temporary success into permanent obligation, to mistake applause for stability. This house warns what happens next. It shows what occurs when identity becomes architectural, when reputation becomes a structure that must be heated, staffed, defended, and paid for long after its purpose has expired. When the cost of maintaining appearances exceeds the cost of changing course. But pride makes changing course impossible. The mansion didn't just bankrupt its owner. It explained, too late, the rules he had been playing by. And those rules had changed. The house remained. The lesson remained. The timing never forgave.